The wind howled through the empty streets of Black Hollow, carrying with it the scent of rot and decay. Houses, once filled with the warmth of small-town life, now stood in ruin, windows shattered, doors swinging aimlessly in the gusts like gaping mouths. There was no laughter, no movement, only silence, the kind that gnawed at the mind, scratching at the edge of sanity. Luke, the town sheriff, stood in the center of the main street, his heart racing as he surveyed the devastation. He had never seen anything like it. The streets, once familiar, were now littered with the bodies of people he had grown up with, their expressions frozen in grotesque agony. His stomach churned as he stepped over the corpse of old Mrs. Green, her arms twisted unnaturally behind her back, her eyes wide open in terror. "How did it come to this?" he muttered, but he already knew the answer. Evening. It had all started when she arrived, with her flowing blonde hair, soft-spoken voice, and eyes that sparkled with a strange magnetic light. She had come out of nowhere, with a promise of salvation and peace, and the town had welcomed her. A cruel laugh escaped his lips as he kicked a stone down the street. Salvation. Eve had promised them salvation, but what she had brought was something else. Something darker. Luke's thoughts spun back to the beginning, when the first few people had started following her. It seemed harmless at first. She spoke of cleansing, of purity, of preparing for the ascension. Her words wrapped around the townspeople like a warm blanket on a cold day, soothing their fears, their insecurities. But Luke had always felt something off about her. Something in the way her eyes lingered too long on those who questioned her. Something in her smile that never reached her eyes. As time passed, her influence grew. People quit their jobs, abandoned their families, and moved to the outskirts of town where Eve had set up her commune. It was there that the true horror began. Luke had heard the rumors, whispers of bizarre rituals, of people disappearing in the night, never to be seen again. But it wasn't until his deputy, a young, eager man named Mark, went to investigate that Luke finally understood the gravity of the situation. Mark had returned from the commune one night, pale and trembling, with wild eyes that darted around as though they expected something to jump out of the shadows at any moment. He had refused to talk about what he saw, but the fear in his eyes told Luke everything he needed to know. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Eve's influence continued to spread, and soon the entire town was caught in her web. Friends turned against each other, neighbors reported neighbors for imagined sins, and families were torn apart. Those who didn't join her flock were shunned, their homes vandalized, their property burned, and then the cleansings began. The first body was found near the river, a young woman, her skin flayed in long strips, her eyes gouged out, her limbs arranged in a grotesque parody of prayer. Carved into her chest were the words, "Forgive me, Eve." The town recoiled in horror, but instead of turning against Eve, they rallied to her, convinced that the poor girl had been cleansed of her sins and ascended to a higher plane. It was madness. Luke clenched his fists, his knuckles white against his weathered skin. He had tried to stop her, tried to warn the town, but it was too late. Eve's followers were everywhere, and they would do anything for her, even kill. He closed his eyes, the memory of the last time he had confronted her burning in his mind. He had gone to the commune, hoping to reason with her, to plead with her to stop the madness. But when he arrived, he found her standing in the center of a circle of her followers, her head tilted back, arms raised to the heavens. Her skin glowed with an unnatural light, her eyes shimmering with a malevolent power. And then, in a voice that was both beautiful and terrible, she had spoken. "You dare question me, Sheriff," she had whispered, her voice wrapping around his mind like a snake. I am a messenger of the divine. I am here to cleanse this world of its filth, to burn away the impurities of mankind. You are nothing but a speck of dust in the grand design." Her words had sent a chill down his spine, but it was the sight of her followers standing in silent reverence around her that truly terrified him. Their faces were blank, devoid of any emotion, their eyes glazed over as though they were no longer human. And in that moment, Luke knew he was staring into the face of something not of this world. He had barely escaped with his life that night, but others had not been so lucky. The bodies continued to pile up, each one more grotesque than the last. Victims were found with their tongues cut out, their limbs dismembered, their bodies mutilated in ways that defied comprehension. And through it all, Eve stood at the center, her angelic face serene, her smile gentle, as though she were watching over a flock of innocent lambs. But Luke knew better. He had seen her true form, if only for a moment. In a fleeting glimpse, as he fled the commune, he had seen her wings, blackened, charred, like the wings of a fallen angel. And her eyes, oh God, her eyes. They had glowed with an unholy light, the pupils elongated, almost reptilian, filled with malice. The sound of footsteps snapped Luke out of his reverie. He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his hip, but it was only Hannah, the town's doctor. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she approached. "Luke," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They found more bodies. By the old church." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Together they made their way to the church, the last remnants of the town's sanity clinging to the old wooden structure like a lifeline. But when they arrived, what they saw shattered whatever hope remained. The churchyard was littered with bodies, men, women, children, all arranged in a grotesque tableau of worship. Their limbs were twisted into unnatural shapes, their mouths frozen in silent screams. At the center of it all stood Eve, her once beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. Her wings stretched out behind her, black and tattered, casting long shadows over the scene. Her eyes glowed with that same otherworldly light, her lips curling into a wicked smile as she gazed upon her handiwork. "You've come to join us, Sheriff," she cooed, her voice dripping with mockery. "How lovely." Luke raised his gun, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "This ends now, Eve," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Eve laughed, a sound that echoed through the churchyard like the tolling of a funeral bell. "Oh, Sheriff," she purred, "it's only just begun." And with that, she raised her arms, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The bodies in the churchyard twitched, their limbs jerking violently as though possessed by some unseen force. Luke watched in horror as the dead rose, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their mouths moving in silent prayer. Hannah screamed, but Luke didn't have time to comfort her. He fired his gun, the sound echoing through the night, but the bullets had no effect. The dead kept coming, their rotting hands reaching for him, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. Desperation clawed at his mind as he backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Eve, her smile widening as she watched him struggle. "Do you see now, Sheriff?" she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "Do you see the truth? I am the new god of this world, and you are nothing." The last thing Luke saw before the darkness claimed him was Eve, perched atop a mountain of bodies, her wings spread wide, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. And as the world faded away, her voice echoed in his mind, cold and unforgiving. "This is only the beginning.